The handcuffs clicked with a metallic finality that echoed through the stunned courtroom. Judge Victoria Hartwell stared in disbelief at her own wrists, the reality of what just happened crashing over her like a cold wave. Minutes earlier, she had been mocking the man before her, never imagining that the tables could turn so dramatically. It started like any other morning in Atlanta's Superior Court, with Judge Hartwell presiding over what she assumed would be a routine contempt hearing. The defendant, Marcus Hamilton, stood alone at the defense table, dressed in a simple gray suit that had seen better days. No lawyer beside him, just a stack of papers and an air of quiet determination. "Well, well," Judge Hartwell began, peering down from her elevated bench with barely concealed disdain. "Another pro se defendant who thinks he knows the law better than the professionals. This should be entertaining." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom from the bailiff and court staff, all too familiar with the judge's sharp tongue. Marcus remained standing, his posture straight but not defiant, his hands resting calmly on the table before him. At 45, he had the weathered look of someone who had faced more than his share of challenges, but his eyes held a clarity that suggested he wasn't here by accident. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice steady and measured, "I'm here regarding the contempt charge filed against me for allegedly violating a court order in case number 2024 CV 1892. Judge Hartwell waved her hand dismissively. Yes, I've read the file. You were ordered to pay $15,000 in damages, failed to do so, and now you're wasting the court's time with excuses." She leaned back in her chair, adjusting her reading glasses. "Let me guess, you're going to tell me you couldn't afford it, or there's been some terrible misunderstanding." The prosecutor, Sarah Chen, stood up with a slight smirk. "Your Honor, the state's position is clear. Mr. Hamilton has willfully ignored a direct court order. We're seeking jail time until he complies." Marcus didn't flinch at the threat. Instead, he picked up one of his documents. "Actually, Your Honor, there's a significant problem with the original order. If you'll allow me to explain." "Oh, please," Judge Hartwell interrupted, rolling her eyes. Another self-appointed legal expert who probably got his law degree from YouTube University. More laughter from the gallery. "Mr. Hamilton, do you even understand the gravity of your situation? You're facing potential jail time, and you're standing here without proper representation, thinking you can talk your way out of this?" Marcus took a measured breath before responding. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I understand the situation perfectly. That's precisely why I'm representing myself. The original judgment was obtained through fraud, and I have evidence to prove it." The judge's expression shifted from amusement to irritation. "Fraud? That's a serious allegation, Mr. Hamilton. I hope you have more than just your word to back that up, because making baseless accusations in my courtroom is a quick way to find yourself in even more trouble." "I have documentation," Marcus replied, lifting a folder. "Bank records, emails, and sworn affidavits that demonstrate the plaintiff in the original case fabricated evidence and committed perjury." Judge Hartwell's lips curled into a condescending smile. "How convenient. And I suppose next you'll tell me that everyone's out to get you, that the whole system is rigged against you." She glanced at the prosecutor. "Ms. Chen, how long do we have to entertain this charade?" The prosecutor shrugged. "Your Honor, we could proceed directly to sentencing. The contempt is clear-cut." But Marcus wasn't backing down. "Your Honor, I'm asking for the opportunity to present my evidence. The Sixth Amendment guarantees my right to defend myself, and due process requires that you at least examine what I've brought before making a ruling." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Don't lecture me about constitutional law, Mr. Hamilton. I've been on this bench for 15 years, and I've seen every trick in the book. People like you always think you're special, that the rules don't apply to you." The phrase hung in the air, heavy with implication. People like you. The courtroom grew quieter, the atmosphere shifting palpably. Marcus straightened his shoulders slightly. "What exactly do you mean by people like me, Your Honor?" Judge Hartwell caught herself, but only barely. People who refuse to take responsibility for their actions, who think they can manipulate the system with sob stories and excuses. "I see," Marcus said quietly. "And would you say that assessment is based on the facts of my case, or on something else entirely?" The judge's face reddened. "How dare you imply? I'll have you know I treat everyone who comes before this court equally, regardless of—" She stopped herself again, but the damage was done. "Regardless of what, Your Honor?" Marcus pressed gently but firmly. "That's enough," Judge Hartwell snapped, her composure cracking. "You're trying my patience, Mr. Hamilton. One more word out of line, and I'll add additional contempt charges." Marcus nodded slowly, then returned to his documents. "Very well, Your Honor. Then let me stick to the facts. The plaintiff in the original case, Thompson Industries, claimed I breached a contract to provide consulting services. However, I have here an email chain showing that their CEO, Robert Thompson, instructed his staff to backdate invoices and create false documentation to support their claim." He held up a printed email. This message, dated March 15, 2024, clearly shows Mr. Thompson writing, quote, "Make sure the dates match our story. Hamilton won't have the resources to fight this properly, and even if he tries, Judge Carter will side with us. We've contributed enough to his campaign to ensure that." The courtroom stirred. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Judge Hartwell's knuckles whitened as she gripped her gavel. "That's a very serious accusation," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You're suggesting judicial corruption?" "I'm presenting evidence, Your Honor. Judge Carter did, in fact, rule against me without allowing me to present any defense. The transcript shows he cut me off repeatedly and refused to admit my evidence into the record." "Enough," Judge Hartwell slammed her gavel. "This conspiracy theory nonsense ends now. Mr. Hamilton, I find you in contempt of the original order. I sentence you to 30 days in county jail, sentence to begin immediately. Bailiff." The bailiff stepped forward, hand moving to his handcuffs, but Marcus raised his hand calmly. "Your Honor, before you do that, there's something else you should know." "I've heard enough from you," she spat. "Bailiff, take him into custody." "Judge Hartwell," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtroom, "are you aware that this entire proceeding is being monitored?" The judge froze. "What are you talking about?" Marcus reached into his jacket pocket slowly, making sure the bailiff could see his movements. He pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a badge that caught the morning light streaming through the courtroom windows. "Special Agent Marcus Hamilton, FBI, Public Corruption Division." The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye in the courtroom fixed on the badge, then swiveled to Judge Hartwell, whose face had gone pale. This is, she stammered. "This is part of a 2-year investigation into judicial corruption in this district," Marcus continued, his voice now carrying the authority of his true position. "We've been tracking campaign contributions, case assignments, and suspicious ruling patterns. Your behavior today, Your Honor, has been particularly illuminating." The prosecutor slowly sat down, her face a mask of shock. The court reporter's fingers had stopped moving over her keys. "You can't— This is entrapment," Judge Hartwell protested, but her voice had lost its commanding tone. "Not at all," Marcus replied. "I came here as a legitimate defendant in a legitimate case. Every document I've shown you is real. The corruption I've described is real. And your response to it, including your barely veiled racial bias, has all been documented." He turned slightly, addressing the back of the courtroom where a woman in a dark suit had been sitting quietly. "Agent Rivera, I believe we have what we need. The woman stood, also displaying FBI credentials. Yes, Agent Hamilton. The recording is clear. Judge Hartwell's hands gripped the edge of her bench. You can't do this. I have immunity. I have rights. You have the right to remain silent, Marcus began, as Agent Rivera approached the bench. You have the right to an attorney. This is absurd, Judge Hartwell shouted, standing abruptly. I will not be treated like a common criminal in my own courtroom. Your courtroom, Marcus asked quietly. This courtroom belongs to the people, Your Honor, and you've forgotten that you serve them, not the other way around. As Agent Rivera reached the bench, Judge Hartwell's defiance crumbled. Wait, she said, her voice now pleading. We can discuss this. There's been a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, Marcus replied, was yours. You thought your position made you untouchable. You thought you could mock and dismiss people based on your assumptions and prejudices without consequence. Agent Rivera produced handcuffs. Judge Victoria Hartwell, you're under arrest for corruption, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of civil rights under color of law. The metallic click of the handcuffs closing around Judge Hartwell's wrists punctuated the end of her reign in the courtroom. As she was led away, Marcus turned to address the stunned gallery. For too long, justice in this courthouse has been for sale. That ends today. The FBI will be reviewing every case Judge Hartwell has presided over in the past 5 years. If you believe you were treated unfairly, denied due process, or subjected to bias, please contact our office. The court reporter finally found her voice. Should I still be recording? Marcus smiled slightly. Every word. This is now part of the official record. The people deserve to know what happened here today. As Judge Hartwell was escorted out through the same door she had used to send so many others to jail, the irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The gavel she had wielded like a weapon now sat abandoned on the bench, a symbol of power corrupted and finally, justice restored. But for Marcus Hamilton, this was just the beginning. The investigation would continue and more arrests would follow. The system that had allowed someone like Judge Hartwell to flourish would be dismantled piece by piece, because justice, real justice, was never about the person wearing the robe or carrying the badge. It was about truth, fairness, and the radical idea that everyone who walked into a courtroom deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Marcus gathered his documents, the same ones Judge Hartwell had dismissed so carelessly. Each page represented hours of investigation, careful planning, and an unwavering commitment to the principle that no one was above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. 2 years earlier, Marcus Hamilton sat in a windowless FBI conference room in Atlanta, surrounded by case files, photographs, and flowcharts that mapped a web of corruption so intricate it looked like a spider's web. His partner, Special Agent Elena Rivera, pushed another stack of documents across the table. Look at this pattern, she said, highlighting a series of campaign contributions. Judge Hartwell received donations from 16 different law firms, all of which have an unusually high success rate in her courtroom. Marcus studied the papers, his analytical mind connecting dots that others might miss. Before joining the FBI, he had been a civil rights attorney in Chicago, fighting cases that most lawyers wouldn't touch. He had seen firsthand how the system could be twisted, how justice could be bought and sold, and how the people who suffered most were those who could least afford to fight back. It's not just the money, Marcus said, running his finger down a list of case outcomes. Look at the demographics. When the defendant is African American or Latino, her conviction rate jumps by 30%. When they're representing themselves, it's almost 90%. Elena nodded grimly. But proving bias is different from proving corruption. We need something concrete. That's when the Thompson Industries case landed on their desk. A small business owner named David Chen had filed a complaint with the FBI, claiming he had been railroaded in Judge Hartwell's court after refusing to pay a bribe. His story was eerily similar to dozens of others they had collected. Thompson Industries has a pattern, Marcus noted, pulling up their litigation history. They sue small businesses, usually minority-owned, for breach of contract. The contracts are always vague, the evidence is thin, but somehow they keep winning, and look who's hearing most of their cases. Hartwell, Elena confirmed, but how do we prove the connection? Marcus leaned back in his chair, thinking. We need to experience it firsthand. We need someone to go through her courtroom as a defendant, someone who knows what to look for. Elena raised an eyebrow. You're not seriously suggesting? Why not? I fit the profile. African American, no legal representation, fighting a corporate plaintiff. She won't be able to resist. Marcus, this is dangerous. If she suspects anything, she won't, Marcus assured her. I've spent my whole life dealing with people like her. They never see us as threats, just targets. The plan took months to set up. They created a bulletproof backstory, complete with a fake consulting business and doctored financial records that would stand up to scrutiny. Thompson Industries was already under FBI surveillance, making it easy to intercept their communications and predict their next target. When Thompson Industries filed suit against Marcus Hamilton Consulting, everything fell into place exactly as predicted. The case was assigned to Judge Hartwell, and Marcus prepared to play his role as the overwhelmed pro-se defendant. The first hearing had been revealing. Judge Hartwell's contempt was barely concealed as she rushed through the proceedings, cutting Marcus off repeatedly and showing clear favoritism toward Thompson's attorneys. But it was during a recess that things got interesting. Marcus had positioned himself near the judge's chambers, pretending to review documents, when he overheard a conversation between Hartwell and one of Thompson's lawyers. Don't worry about Hamilton, the judge was saying. These people always think they can beat the system. Just make sure the payment goes through the usual channels. These people. The phrase echoed in Marcus's mind, confirming what the data had suggested but couldn't quite prove. The bias wasn't just statistical, it was personal, ingrained, and weaponized. Back in the FBI offices, the team pored over the recordings from that first hearing. Assistant Director Patricia Morgan, a veteran of public corruption cases, listened with growing concern. This is bigger than we thought, she said, pausing the playback. Hartwell isn't just taking bribes. She's part of a systematic effort to use the courts to destroy minority-owned businesses. It's modern-day redlining, Marcus added. Instead of denying loans, they're using frivolous lawsuits and corrupt judges to achieve the same result. The investigation expanded. They discovered a network of judges, lawyers, and corporate executives who had turned the justice system into a profit center. Small businesses would be targeted with lawsuits, forced into settlements, or driven into bankruptcy, and their assets would be acquired at fire sale prices. Elena uncovered financial records showing millions of dollars flowing through shell companies, eventually landing in offshore accounts linked to Judge Hartwell and her co-conspirators. But they needed more than money trails. They needed to catch her in the act. The contempt hearing, Marcus suggested during a strategy session. That's our opportunity. She'll be overconfident, thinking she's dealing with just another victim. We'll have full surveillance, and I'll push just hard enough to expose her bias. It's risky, Director Morgan warned. If she holds you in contempt and orders immediate incarceration, we might have to blow your cover to get you out. Then we make sure it doesn't come to that, Marcus replied. I know how to handle people like her. They're so used to their power being absolute that they never expect resistance. The night before the hearing, Marcus sat in his apartment, reviewing the case files one more time. His phone buzzed with a text from Elena. You sure about this? He typed back, absolutely, this is why I joined the Bureau. But it was more than that. Marcus thought about his father, who had owned a small auto repair shop in Detroit until a similar lawsuit had destroyed his business. He remembered the defeat in his father's eyes, the way he had aged 10 years and 6 months, the way he had whispered, "The system isn't for people like us, son." Marcus had spent his entire career proving his father wrong, fighting to make the system work for everyone. Now he had a chance to expose the very corruption that had stolen his father's dreams. The morning of the contempt hearing, Marcus arrived early at the courthouse. He passed through security, nodding at the guards who had no idea about his true identity. In the restroom, he checked his concealed recording device one last time. Everything was in place. Agent Rivera was already seated in the gallery, positioned to observe everything. They had additional agents stationed outside the courthouse and monitoring electronic communications. The trap was set. As Marcus took his place at the defendant's table, he noticed something different about Judge Hartwell. She seemed more agitated than usual, perhaps sensing that something was off. But her arrogance quickly reasserted itself when she saw him standing alone. What followed was a masterclass in judicial misconduct. Hartwell's bias became increasingly obvious as she dismissed his evidence without examination, mocked his arguments, and made thinly veiled references to his race. Each comment, each eye roll, each dismissive gesture was captured by multiple recording devices. The turning point came when Marcus presented the email evidence of fraud. Hartwell's reaction, immediate dismissal without even looking at the documents, was exactly what they needed. Her subsequent threat of jail time for conspiracy theories sealed her fate. But it was her comment about people like you that would resonate in the eventual trial. In those 3 words, she had revealed not just personal bias, but a systematic approach to justice that treated defendants differently based on their race and resources. When Marcus finally revealed his FBI credentials, the look on Hartwell's face was one he would never forget. It wasn't just shock or fear, it was the dawning realization that her worldview had been fundamentally wrong. The people she had dismissed and demeaned weren't powerless victims. They were capable of fighting back, of demanding justice, of bringing down the very system that oppressed them. As Hartwell was led away in handcuffs, Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions. Satisfaction at completing the mission, certainly, but also sadness at how deeply the corruption ran. How many people had suffered in her courtroom? How many businesses had been destroyed? How many lives had been derailed by her prejudice and greed? The aftermath of the arrest was swift and far-reaching. Within hours, the U.S. Attorney's Office had filed charges against Judge Hartwell and issued warrants for several co-conspirators. The local news media, initially skeptical, soon realized they were witnessing the unraveling of one of the largest judicial corruption scandals in Georgia history. Marcus spent the rest of that day in meetings with prosecutors, reviewing evidence and planning next steps. The investigation would continue for months, maybe years, as they traced every tendril of the conspiracy. But the hardest part was over. They had cracked the facade of respectability that had protected these corrupt officials for so long. That evening, as Marcus finally headed home, his phone rang. It was his father. "I saw the news," his father said, his voice thick with emotion. "That judge, the one you arrested, was that your case?" "Yeah, Dad, it was." There was a long pause. "I'm proud of you, son. Maybe I was wrong about the system." Marcus smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "No, Dad, you weren't wrong. The system was broken. We're just trying to fix it." As he drove through the Atlanta streets, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From watching his father lose everything to becoming an FBI agent dedicated to rooting out corruption, it had been a long road. But today had proven that change was possible, that justice could prevail, and that sometimes the people who seemed powerless could become the most powerful force for change. The morning after Judge Hartwell's arrest, the FBI's Atlanta field office buzzed with an energy that bordered on chaos. Phones rang incessantly, reporters gathered outside like hungry wolves, and federal prosecutors arrived in waves, each eager to be part of what was already being called the biggest corruption case in Georgia's judicial history. Marcus sat in a conference room with Elena Rivera and Assistant U.S. Attorney Catherine Walsh, surrounded by evidence boxes and computer screens displaying financial records. The walls were covered with photographs, diagrams, and timelines that mapped out the conspiracy they were still uncovering. "We've got 12 more judges we need to look at," Catherine said, highlighting names on a list. Hartwell's financial records show regular transfers to and from accounts linked to these other courtrooms. Elena pulled up a spreadsheet on her laptop. "And that's just the judges. We've identified 43 lawyers who appear to be part of this network, plus 16 corporate executives. This thing is massive." Marcus nodded, but his attention was drawn to a stack of letters that had arrived overnight. "Look at these," he said, spreading them across the table. Victims coming forward, people who lost their businesses, their homes, their life savings in Hartwell's courtroom. They're finally feeling safe enough to speak up. One letter in particular caught his eye. It was from Maria Gonzalez, who had owned a small catering business until Thompson Industries sued her for alleged contract violations. "I knew the charges were false," she wrote, "but Judge Hartwell wouldn't even look at my evidence. She called me incompetent and suggested I should stick to cooking instead of trying to run a business. I lost everything." "We need to interview all of them," Marcus said. "Their stories will help establish the pattern of discrimination and corruption." Catherine nodded. "I'm already working on setting up a victim restitution fund. The assets we're seizing from Hartwell and her co-conspirators should help make some of these people whole again." Outside the conference room, the field office was dealing with the media frenzy. Special Agent in charge Ronald Matthews held his third press conference in 24 hours, carefully balancing the need for transparency with the ongoing investigation's requirements. "The FBI is committed to rooting out corruption wherever we find it," Matthews told the assembled reporters. "No one is above the law, regardless of their position or title. This investigation is far from over." Meanwhile, at the Fulton County Courthouse, panic was setting in among the judicial staff. Judges who had worked alongside Hartwell for years were suddenly unavailable for comment. Court clerks whispered in hallways, wondering if their bosses might be next. The entire system seemed to be holding its breath. Judge Theodore Ramsey, the chief judge of the circuit, called an emergency meeting of all sitting judges. "We need full cooperation with the FBI," he announced to the assembled jurists. "If anyone has information about corrupt practices in our courts, now is the time to come forward. The integrity of our entire system is at stake." But not everyone was eager to cooperate. That afternoon, Marcus received word that several suspects were attempting to flee the country. Thompson Industries CEO Robert Thompson had booked a private jet to the Cayman Islands, where much of the corruption money was hidden. "We need arrest warrants now," Marcus told Catherine Walsh. "If Thompson gets on that plane, we might lose him forever." Within hours, FBI agents surrounded Thompson's mansion in Buckhead. The arrest was captured by news helicopters, the footage showing Thompson being led away in handcuffs while his lawyers shouted about witch hunts and government overreach. As the investigation widened, Marcus found himself becoming the public face of the operation. His background as a civil rights attorney, combined with his role in exposing Hartwell, made him a compelling figure for the media, but Marcus was careful to keep the focus on the victims and the broader implications of the case. In an interview with CNN, he explained, "This isn't just about one corrupt judge or a handful of greedy lawyers. This is about a system that was weaponized against the most vulnerable members of our society. Small business owners, particularly minorities, were systematically targeted and destroyed through our courts. That's not justice, that's economic warfare." The interview struck a chord. Social media exploded with stories from people who had experienced similar treatment in courtrooms across the country. The hashtag Justice Denied began trending, with thousands sharing their encounters with biased judges and corrupt legal proceedings. Back at the FBI office, the team was working around the clock to process the flood of new information. Bank records revealed a sophisticated money laundering operation that stretched from Atlanta to offshore accounts in multiple countries. Shell companies had been created to hide bribes, and campaign contributions had been carefully structured to avoid detection. "Look at this," Elena called out one evening, her eyes fixed on her computer screen. "I found a communication between Hartwell and a state senator. They're discussing legislation that would make it harder for pro-SE defendants to appeal judgments. They were literally trying to change the laws to protect their scheme." The revelation added a new dimension to the investigation. Political corruption was now on the table, and several state legislators found themselves under scrutiny. The governor's office issued a statement promising full cooperation with federal authorities and announcing a review of all judicial appointments made in the past decade. As the weeks passed, the investigation's impact rippled through Atlanta's legal community. Law firms that had benefited from the corrupt system suddenly found themselves losing clients. Several prominent attorneys quietly resigned from their positions and left the state. The local bar association announced new ethics guidelines and mandatory training on identifying and reporting judicial misconduct. For Marcus, the most rewarding part of the investigation was meeting with the victims. He spent hours listening to their stories, documenting their losses, and assuring them that justice would be served. Many broke down in tears, overwhelmed by the validation that they hadn't been crazy or incompetent. They had been targeted by a corrupt system. One particularly moving meeting was with James Patterson, an elderly man who had lost his family's funeral home business to a fraudulent lawsuit. "I thought I was going senile," he told Marcus, his hands shaking as he held a cup of coffee. "Judge Hartwell made me feel so stupid, so worthless. I started believing I really had mismanaged everything. My family thought I had failed them." Marcus placed a gentle hand on the man's shoulder. "You didn't fail anyone, Mr. Patterson. The system failed you, but we're going to make it right." The investigation team established a pattern that was both disturbing and illuminating. Minority-owned businesses were 3 times more likely to be sued by companies connected to the corruption network. Once in Hartwell's courtroom, they were 5 times more likely to lose their cases than white-owned businesses with similar circumstances. The average judgment against minority defendants was 60% higher than against white defendants. "This is systemic racism disguised as legal proceedings," Marcus explained during a task force meeting. "They found a way to use the courts to enforce discrimination that would be illegal in any other context." The Department of Justice took notice. Attorney General Elizabeth Warren announced that the Atlanta investigation would serve as a model for similar probes in other cities. "What we've uncovered in Atlanta is likely not unique," she said during a press conference. "We're launching a nationwide initiative to examine potential corruption and bias in our judicial system." As more arrests were made and more evidence came to light, Judge Hartwell's attorney attempted to negotiate a plea deal. She was willing to testify against her co-conspirators in exchange for a reduced sentence. The U.S. Attorney's Office was initially receptive, but Marcus argued against it. "She was the linchpin," he said during a strategy meeting. "Without her position and willingness to abuse it, none of this would have been possible. If we let her off easy, what message does that send?" His argument prevailed. Hartwell would face the full weight of federal charges, including racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering, and civil rights violations. Her trial would be a public reckoning for a system that had operated in shadows for too long. 3 months after the initial arrest, the FBI and DOJ held a joint press conference to announce the results of their investigation. 37 people had been arrested, including 5 judges, 22 lawyers, and 10 corporate executives. Millions of dollars in assets had been seized. More than 200 victims had been identified, with more coming forward every day. But for Marcus, the numbers only told part of the story. The real victory was in the faces of people like Maria Gonzalez and James Patterson, who were finally getting their day in court. This time in front of honest judges who would give them a fair hearing. Several had already won reversals of previous judgments and were in the process of rebuilding their businesses. The investigation also sparked broader changes. The state legislature passed new laws requiring financial disclosure for all judicial candidates and establishing an independent commission to investigate allegations of judicial misconduct. Law schools added new courses on legal ethics and the dangers of systemic bias. Community organizations launched programs to help pro-SC defendants navigate the court system and protect their rights. As Marcus packed up his office to return to FBI headquarters in Washington, he reflected on the case that had consumed 2 years of his life. On his desk was a framed photo of his father standing in front of his old auto repair shop. Next to it was a letter from Maria Gonzalez, whose catering business was thriving again. She had written simply, "Thank you for believing in us when no one else would." That, Marcus thought, was what justice really looked like. Not just the handcuffs and headlines, but the quiet restoration of dignity to people who had been denied it for too long. The system could be fixed, but only if good people were willing to fight for it. 6 months after Judge Hartwell's arrest, the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta had become ground zero for what legal experts were calling the trial of the decade. The building's austere marble corridors echoed with the footsteps of lawyers, witnesses, and journalists, all converging on courtroom 2A, where preliminary hearings were about to begin. Marcus Hamilton stood in the prosecutor's conference room, reviewing testimony with Assistant U.S. Attorney Catherine Walsh and a team of federal prosecutors. The walls were lined with evidence boards displaying the intricate web of corruption they had uncovered. Photos of defendants were connected by colored strings to bank records, property deeds, and corporate documents. "We're starting with the money trail," Catherine explained, pointing to a flowchart. Judge Hartwell received over $3.2 million in bribes over 7 years, funneled through 17 different shell companies. But she was just one node in the network. Marcus studied a photograph of Richard Blackstone, senior partner at Blackstone & Associates, the law firm at the center of the conspiracy. Blackstone was the architect, he said. He identified vulnerable businesses, coordinated the lawsuits, and distributed the bribes. Without him, none of this works. "Which is why he's our star witness," Catherine added with a slight smile. "He flipped faster than a pancake when we showed him the evidence. 20 years of potential prison time has a way of encouraging cooperation." The door opened, and Elena Rivera entered with a stack of files. "Just got word from the judge. Hartwell's motion to dismiss was denied. We're proceeding to trial as scheduled." The news was expected but still satisfying. Hartwell's defense team had thrown everything at the wall, hoping something would stick. They had claimed entrapment, prosecutorial misconduct, and even suggested that Marcus's undercover operation violated Hartwell's civil rights. Each argument had been methodically dismantled by the prosecution. That afternoon, Marcus sat in on the deposition of Robert Thompson, whose company had been central to the corruption scheme. Thompson, once arrogant and dismissive, now appeared deflated, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his diminished frame. "Let's talk about the Patterson funeral home case," Catherine began, sliding a document across the table. "Your company sued James Patterson for breach of contract, claiming he failed to deliver services that were never actually ordered. Can you explain how that lawsuit came to be filed?" Thompson's lawyer whispered in his ear, but Thompson waved him off. "Look, it was Blackstone's idea. He said Patterson's property was worth 10 times what the old man thought. The lawsuit was just a way to force him to sell. And Judge Hartwell knew this?" Thompson nodded. She got 15% of whatever we collected. Sometimes in cash, sometimes through campaign contributions, sometimes as consulting fees paid to her husband's company. Marcus watched Thompson carefully. Here was a man who had destroyed dozens of lives without a second thought, now trying to minimize his own culpability. But his testimony was crucial, providing first-hand evidence of the conspiracy. Later that week, Marcus visited the new office space of Patterson Funeral Home. James Patterson had managed to buy back his building after the original judgment was vacated, and his business was slowly recovering. The elderly man greeted Marcus with a warm handshake and insisted on giving him a tour. "My grandfather started this business in 1947, Patterson explained, running his hand along the restored wooden paneling. "When I almost lost it, I thought I was betraying 4 generations of my family. Now I realize I wasn't the one who failed. They tried to steal our legacy." The comment stuck with Marcus. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about destroying family histories, community institutions, and generational wealth. The corruption had torn at the very fabric of Atlanta's minority communities. As trial preparation intensified, the prosecution team worked to make the complex financial crimes understandable to a jury. They created visual aids showing how money flowed from victimized businesses through shell companies to the defendants' personal accounts. They prepared timelines demonstrating the pattern of targeting minority-owned businesses. One evening, as Marcus worked late in the office, he received an unexpected visitor. Carla Simmons, a court clerk who had worked in Hartwell's courtroom for 15 years, appeared at his door looking nervous. "I should have come forward sooner," she said, clutching a worn notebook. "But I was scared. I have 3 kids and this job." Marcus invited her to sit. "What's in the notebook, Ms. Simmons?" She opened it to reveal pages of meticulous notes. "I started keeping track 3 years ago when I noticed patterns. Certain lawyers always got favorable rulings. Certain types of defendants always lost. I documented everything. Dates, case numbers, unusual ex parte communications." The notebook was a gold mine, providing contemporaneous documentation of Hartwell's biased behavior. Simmons had recorded instances of Hartwell meeting privately with favored attorneys, making prejudicial comments about defendants, and even discussing case outcomes before hearing evidence. "Why didn't you report this earlier?" Marcus asked gently. Tears welled in Simmons's eyes. "I tried once. I went to the chief judge, but he told me I was being paranoid. After that, Hartwell made my life hell. She threatened to have me fired, said no one would believe a black woman's word against a federal judge." Marcus felt a familiar anger rising, but kept his voice calm. "Your courage in coming forward now will make a difference. This notebook corroborates everything we've discovered." As the trial date approached, the defense team's strategy became clear. They would attempt to paint Hartwell as a tough but fair judge who had been caught up in a larger conspiracy orchestrated by others. They suggested she was being scapegoated because of her gender and position. During a pre-trial hearing, Hartwell's lead attorney, Jonathan Crawford, argued passionately, "Your Honor, my client dedicated 20 years to public service. She's being vilified by prosecutors who needed a high-profile target to justify their investigation." Catherine Walsh responded with controlled fury. "The defendant abused her position to enrich herself while destroying lives and businesses. She weaponized the very system she swore to serve. This isn't about making an example, it's about justice." The judge, Miriam Rodriguez, known for her fair but firm approach, listened carefully before ruling. "The evidence presented by the government is substantial and troubling. The defendant's motions are denied. We will proceed to trial." Outside the courthouse, the media circus continued to grow. Cable news featured nightly debates about judicial corruption, systemic racism in the courts, and the broader implications of the case. Legal experts dissected every filing while community activists used the case to push for reform. Marcus found himself caught between his role as an FBI agent and his identity as a black man who had experienced the system's inequities firsthand. In a rare personal interview, he told a reporter, "This case isn't just about corruption. It's about how that corruption specifically targeted communities of color. We can't separate the financial crimes from the racial discrimination. They were two sides of the same coin." The comment sparked national discussion. Social media lit up with personal stories of courtroom bias. Legal scholars wrote op-eds about the intersection of corruption and discrimination. Civil rights organizations announced they were monitoring the trial and would push for systemic reforms based on its outcome. Meanwhile, the victim impact statements continued to pour in. Marcus spent hours reading through them, each one a testament to the human cost of corruption. There was the immigrant family who lost their restaurant and had to return to their home country, the young entrepreneur whose tech startup was destroyed by a frivolous lawsuit, the widow who nearly lost her home to predatory litigation. One particularly poignant statement came from Andre Williams, a contractor who had been targeted by the scheme. "I served my country in Iraq, came home and started a business, only to have it stolen by people who were supposed to uphold justice. They didn't just take my money, they took my faith in America." As jury selection began, the prosecution team faced a delicate challenge. They needed jurors who could understand complex financial transactions while also grasping the racial dynamics at play. The defense sought to exclude anyone with strong opinions about systemic racism or judicial reform. During voir dire, Marcus watched carefully as potential jurors answered questions. An elderly white woman admitted she had trouble believing judges could be corrupt. A young black man expressed anger about discrimination in the courts. A middle-aged Asian business owner shared her own experience with biased treatment in legal proceedings. The final jury was a diverse group that reflected Atlanta's population, black and white, young and old, working class and professional. They would be tasked with untangling a conspiracy that had operated in plain sight for years, protected by the very respectability of its participants. On the eve of opening statements, Marcus sat in his hotel room, reviewing his notes for his upcoming testimony. As the agent who had exposed the conspiracy, he would be a key witness, walking the jury through the investigation and his undercover operation. His phone buzzed with a text from his father. "Watching the news. They're calling you a hero. I always knew you'd change things." Marcus smiled but felt the weight of expectation. This trial wasn't just about convicting Hartwell and her co-conspirators. It was about exposing a system that had allowed corruption to flourish, about validating the experiences of countless victims, and about proving that justice could prevail even against those who controlled its mechanisms. Tomorrow, the trial would begin. The evidence would be presented, witnesses would testify, and 12 ordinary citizens would decide whether a federal judge had betrayed her oath. But Marcus knew the verdict would reverberate far beyond the courtroom. This case had already changed how people thought about justice in America. It had forced a reckoning with the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the greatest threat to justice came from those sworn to protect it. And it had shown that even the most powerful could be held accountable when good people refused to look away. As he prepared for bed, Marcus thought about all the victims he had met, all the stories he had heard. Tomorrow, they would finally have their day in court. In a real court with honest proceedings and the promise of true justice. It had been a long journey from that day in Hartwell's courtroom when she had mocked him, never suspecting that her prejudice would be her downfall. Now the tables had truly turned. The first day of United States versus Victoria Hartwell dawned crisp and clear, with spring sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the federal courthouse. By 7 a.m., a line of spectators stretched around the block while news vans claimed every available parking space. This wasn't just another trial. It was a reckoning. Inside courtroom 2A, Marcus Hamilton took his seat behind the prosecution table, his badge tucked away but his FBI training evident in how he surveyed the room. The gallery was packed with reporters, victims, civil rights activists, and curious citizens. He recognized several small business owners whose lives had been devastated by Hartwell's corruption. At 9 sharp, Judge Miriam Rodriguez entered, her robes rustling softly. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the room stood as one. Rodriguez, a former public defender appointed to the federal bench just 3 years prior, had a reputation for fairness and keen attention to detail. "Please be seated," she said, adjusting her glasses. "We are here in the matter of United States versus Victoria Hartwell. Are both sides ready to proceed with opening statements?" Catherine Walsh rose. "The government is ready, Your Honor." Jonathan Crawford, Hartwell's lead attorney, stood as well. "The defense is ready." Judge Rodriguez nodded. "Ms. Walsh, you may begin." Catherine moved to the center of the courtroom, pausing to make eye contact with each juror. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about betrayal. Betrayal of trust, betrayal of justice, and betrayal of the most fundamental principles that our legal system is built upon." She gestured toward the defense table, where Hartwell sat rigidly, her face a mask of composure. The defendant took an oath to administer justice fairly and impartially. Instead, she turned her courtroom into a profit center, selling verdicts to the highest bidder and systematically targeting minority-owned businesses for financial destruction. Catherine walked to a large screen and clicked a remote. A chart appeared showing the flow of money from victimized businesses to Hartwell's accounts. Over 7 years, the defendant received more than $3 million in bribes, but the cost wasn't just financial. Small businesses were destroyed, families lost their livelihoods, communities were devastated. She turned back to the jury. "You will hear from FBI agent Marcus Hamilton, who went undercover to expose this corruption. You will hear from victims who lost everything in Judge Hartwell's courtroom. You will see financial records, emails, and recorded conversations that prove beyond any reasonable doubt that the defendant betrayed her oath for personal gain." Catherine's voice hardened. "But this case is about more than money. It's about how the defendant weaponized her position to target people she saw as beneath her, minorities, small business owners, anyone who couldn't afford high-priced lawyers. She turned justice into a commodity, available only to those who could pay her price." As Catherine returned to her seat, Crawford rose for the defense. He was tall and silver-haired, with the polish of someone who had argued before the Supreme Court. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice resonating with practiced authority, "the government wants you to believe that Judge Hartwell, a dedicated public servant with 20 years on the bench, suddenly became a criminal mastermind. They want you to see conspiracy where there was simply tough justice." He paced before the jury box. Judge Hartwell presided over thousands of cases. She made tough decisions, unpopular decisions, but always lawful ones. The prosecution has cherry-picked a handful of cases and spun a narrative of corruption where none exists. Crawford pointed toward the prosecution table. They sent an FBI agent to entrap her, to provoke reactions they could twist into evidence. They've pressured witnesses to testify in exchange for leniency. This isn't justice. It's a witch hunt designed to make headlines and advance careers. He paused, letting his words sink in. Judge Hartwell is not perfect, no judge is, but being stern, being tough on unprepared litigants is not a crime. Having high standards is not corruption. We ask you to look past the prosecution's inflammatory rhetoric and focus on the actual evidence, or lack thereof. As Crawford sat down, Judge Rodriguez addressed the prosecution. "Ms. Walsh, please call your first witness." The government calls Special Agent Marcus Hamilton. Marcus rose, straightening his tie as he approached the witness stand. After being sworn in, he settled into the chair, his posture relaxed but alert. Catherine began with background questions, establishing Marcus's credentials and experience. Then she moved to the heart of the matter. Agent Hamilton, how did you become involved in investigating Judge Hartwell? Our public corruption unit received multiple complaints about unusual patterns in Judge Hartwell's courtroom, Marcus explained. Statistical analysis showed minority-owned businesses were losing cases at a rate that couldn't be explained by chance alone. What kind of patterns did you observe? Minority defendants in her courtroom were 3 times more likely to lose their cases than white defendants with similar fact patterns. They received judgments averaging 60% higher, and there was a clear correlation between large campaign contributions to Judge Hartwell and favorable rulings. Catherine displayed a chart on the screen. Can you explain what we're looking at here? Marcus pointed to the data. This shows the relationship between contributions and case outcomes. Companies that donated to Judge Hartwell's campaign fund had an 87% success rate in her courtroom, compared to 32% for non-donors. Did you investigate these contributions? Yes. We discovered that many were routed through shell companies ultimately controlled by the law firms appearing before her. It was a sophisticated money laundering operation designed to hide quid pro quo arrangements. Catherine moved to the undercover operation. Agent Hamilton, please describe your undercover assignment. Marcus shifted slightly. I posed as a small business owner being sued by Thompson Industries, a company we'd identified as central to the corruption scheme. The goal was to experience firsthand how Judge Hartwell conducted herself with pro-SE minority defendants. And what did you observe? From the moment I entered her courtroom, Judge Hartwell displayed clear bias. She cut me off repeatedly, dismissed my evidence without examination, and made comments suggesting racial prejudice. Crawford jumped up. Objection. The witness is offering opinion, not fact. Judge Rodriguez considered. I'll allow it. The witness is testifying to his direct observations. Continue, Agent Hamilton. Marcus nodded. When I attempted to present evidence of fraud in the case against me, Judge Hartwell refused to look at it. She threatened me with contempt for what she called conspiracy theories. Most tellingly, she referred to people like you when dismissing my arguments. Catherine played an audio recording from the undercover operation. The courtroom listened in tense silence as Hartwell's voice filled the room. People like you always think you're special, that the rules don't apply to you. Agent Hamilton, what did you understand her to mean by people like you? Given the context and her tone, I believe she was referring to my race. Crawford objected again, but was overruled. Catherine continued methodically through the evidence, playing more recordings, displaying financial documents, and having Marcus explain the intricate web of corruption they'd uncovered. Finally, Crawford rose for cross-examination, his manner aggressive from the start. Agent Hamilton, isn't it true that you went into that courtroom intending to provoke Judge Hartwell? No, I went in as a legitimate defendant in a real case. But you were recording her secretly, looking for anything you could use against her. I was documenting the proceedings, yes. But her behavior wasn't provoked. It was consistent with the patterns we'd identified in numerous other cases. Crawford changed tactics. You claim Judge Hartwell showed racial bias, but isn't it possible she was simply being tough on an unprepared litigant? Marcus remained calm. When a judge's toughness disproportionately targets minority defendants, when it correlates with financial payments, and when it includes comments about people like you, that's not toughness, that's discrimination. The cross-examination continued for hours, with Crawford attempting to poke holes in the investigation, suggest entrapment, and paint Marcus as an overzealous agent. But Marcus held firm, his answers precise and backed by evidence. As the day wore on, the prosecution called their next witness, Carla Simmons, the court clerk who had kept detailed notes of Hartwell's misconduct. Her testimony was devastating, providing first-hand accounts of Hartwell meeting privately with favored attorneys and making prejudicial comments about minority defendants. "She once told me," Simmons testified, her voice shaking slightly, "that certain people," and she gestured to indicate their race, "didn't belong in business anyway." She said her courtroom was doing society a favor by putting them back in their place. The gallery gasped. Even Crawford seemed taken aback by the directness of the testimony. By day's end, the prosecution had established a clear pattern of bias and corruption. But this was just the beginning. Over the coming days, victims would testify, financial experts would trace the money, and co-conspirators who had flipped would reveal the inner workings of the scheme. As court adjourned, Marcus caught sight of James Patterson in the gallery. The elderly man nodded at him, tears in his eyes. This was why Marcus had joined the FBI, not just to enforce the law, but to restore faith and justice for people like Patterson who had almost given up hope. Outside the courthouse, protesters had gathered, holding signs reading "Justice for All" and "No One Above the Law." The trial was becoming more than a legal proceeding. It was a movement, a demand for accountability that resonated far beyond Atlanta. Catherine spoke briefly to the press. "Today we began presenting evidence of how a federal judge betrayed her oath for profit. But this case is about more than one person's greed. It's about ensuring that our courts remain places where justice is blind, not for sale." As Marcus headed to his car, he reflected on the day's testimony. They had made a strong start, but he knew the defense would fight back hard. Crawford was too experienced to give up easily, and Hartwell still had powerful friends who didn't want to see her fall. But the truth had momentum now. Each piece of evidence, each witness testimony, each revealed email or financial transaction added weight to their case. The system that had protected Hartwell for so long was finally being exposed to the light. Tomorrow would bring more witnesses, more evidence, more revelations. But today had established the foundation, a pattern of corruption so clear that even Hartwell's most ardent defenders would struggle to explain it away. As he drove through Atlanta's evening traffic, Marcus thought about all the victims who would finally have their day in court. Not as defendants in a rigged system, but as witnesses to truth. Their courage in coming forward had made this possible. Now it was up to 12 jurors to decide whether justice would truly be served. The second week of trial brought a procession of victims to the witness stand, each story adding another layer to the portrait of systematic corruption and bias. The courtroom had become a theater of reckoning, where years of injustice were finally being exposed to the harsh light of truth. Maria Gonzalez took the stand on Tuesday morning, her hands trembling slightly as she was sworn in. The former owner of Casa Maria Catering wore a simple blue dress, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. Despite her nervousness, her voice carried clearly through the courtroom. "Ms. Gonzalez," Catherine Walsh began gently, "can you tell the jury about your business?" "I started Casa Maria Catering 15 years ago," Maria said, her accent soft but distinct. "We specialized in authentic Mexican cuisine for events. We had contracts with several corporations, employed 12 people, mostly from my community." "What happened in Judge Hartwell's courtroom?" Maria's eyes hardened with memory. "Thompson Industries sued us, claiming we breached a contract. But we never signed any contract with them. They had forged documents, fake signatures. I tried to show this to Judge Hartwell, but she wouldn't look at my evidence." "What did she say?" "She said I was wasting the court's time. She called me." Maria paused, swallowing hard. She called me an incompetent immigrant who should stick to cooking instead of trying to run a business. She said American courts weren't for people who couldn't speak proper English. A murmur ran through the gallery. Even Crawford shifted uncomfortably at the defense table. Catherine displayed documents on the screen. "Are these the papers you tried to show Judge Hartwell?" "Yes. My lawyer had found proof that Thompson Industries had created these contracts after the fact. The metadata showed they were made 3 months after the supposed signing date." "Did Judge Hartwell examine these documents?" "No. She said they were irrelevant. She granted summary judgment to Thompson Industries without even holding a proper hearing." The jury leaned forward, several taking notes. Catherine continued methodically through Maria's testimony, establishing how she had lost her business, her savings, and eventually her home. During cross-examination, Crawford tried to minimize the damage. "Ms. Gonzalez, isn't it true that you were behind on several of your business payments?" "Only after the lawsuit started," Maria replied firmly. "Thompson Industries contacted our clients telling them we were being sued for fraud. We lost contracts overnight." "But you had financial problems before that, correct?" "Every small business has challenges, but we were profitable. We had just expanded. Then this lawsuit destroyed everything we built." Crawford pressed on, but Maria held her ground. Her testimony painted a vivid picture of how the corrupt system had targeted successful minority businesses, using the courts as a weapon of economic destruction. The afternoon brought James Patterson to the stand. The elderly funeral director walked slowly but purposefully to the witness chair, his dignity intact despite the ordeal he'd endured. "Mr. Patterson," Catherine began, "how long has your family been in the funeral business?" 76 years, he replied, his voice deep and resonant. "My grandfather started Patterson Funeral Home in 1947, right after the war. We've served the African American community in Atlanta through 3 generations." "What brought you to Judge Hartwell's courtroom?" "Blackstone and Associates sued us on behalf of a property development company. They claimed we had agreed to sell our building, but we never did. The contract they showed had my signature, but it wasn't mine." Catherine displayed the disputed contract. "You're saying this isn't your signature?" "That's correct. I had it analyzed by a handwriting expert, but Judge Hartwell wouldn't allow the expert to testify. She said it would unnecessarily complicate things." "What happened during your hearing?" Patterson's jaw tightened. "Judge Hartwell barely let me speak. When I tried to explain that the funeral home was a family legacy, she cut me off. She said I was being overly emotional and that business was business. She granted the plaintiff's motion for summary judgment in less than 15 minutes. What was the result? We had to sell the building at far below market value. 4 generations of serving our community, almost lost because of forged documents and a judge who wouldn't listen." The jury was visibly moved. Several looked at Hartwell with poorly concealed disgust. Even Judge Rodriguez seemed affected by Patterson's quiet dignity in the face of such injustice. Crawford's cross-examination was notably gentler. "Mr. Patterson, you eventually got your business back, correct?" "Only after Agent Hamilton exposed the corruption. We spent 2 years fighting, spent our life savings on lawyers. My wife's health suffered from the stress. Yes, we got it back, but at what cost?" The next day brought the testimony everyone had been waiting for. Richard Blackstone, the architect of the corruption scheme, now testifying as a cooperating witness. Blackstone entered the courtroom in a gray suit, his silver hair immaculately styled. He had the look of someone accustomed to power, though his current circumstances had clearly humbled him. "Mr. Blackstone," Catherine began, "you've pleaded guilty to conspiracy, racketeering, and mail fraud. Is that correct?" "Yes," he replied, his voice steady but subdued. "You've agreed to testify truthfully in exchange for consideration at sentencing?" "That's correct." "Please tell the jury how the scheme involving Judge Hartwell began." Blackstone cleared his throat. About 8 years ago, I realized that certain judges were more sympathetic to business interests. Judge Hartwell was particularly receptive to arguments about protecting commerce and property rights. How did this evolve into criminal activity? Gradually. First, it was campaign contributions, then speaking fees for her husband. Eventually, we developed a system. My firm would identify valuable properties owned by minorities or small businesses. We'd create grounds for lawsuits, file in her court, and she'd ensure favorable rulings. How was she paid? Multiple ways: cash payments through intermediaries, contributions to her husband's consulting firm, investment opportunities in shell companies. We were careful to create distance between the payments and specific cases. Catherine displayed a chart. Can you explain this diagram? This shows the money flow. We'd collect large judgments or force below-market sales, take our fees, and distribute the proceeds. Judge Hartwell typically received 10 to 15%. Was she aware this money came from rigged cases? Absolutely. We had explicit conversations about which cases were special and required her particular attention. The testimony continued for hours, with Blackstone detailing meeting locations, code words used in communications, and specific cases where outcomes were predetermined. He identified email threads where Hartwell discussed expected results and payment schedules. Crawford's cross-examination was fierce. Mr. Blackstone, you're facing decades in prison, correct? Yes. And you'd say anything to reduce that sentence? I'm telling the truth. Really? The same truth you told your clients when you were stealing from them? The same truth you told the court when you presented forged documents? Blackstone's composure cracked slightly. I'm not proud of what I did, but everything I'm saying today is factual and can be verified by documents and recordings. Crawford continued hammering at Blackstone's credibility, but the documentary evidence supported his testimony. Bank records, emails, and recorded conversations all corroborated the systematic corruption he described. The next witness was FBI forensic accountant Dr. Sarah Chen, who walked the jury through the complex financial web. Using charts and graphs, she showed how millions of dollars had flowed from victimized businesses through shell companies to the defendants. In total, Dr. Chen testified, we traced $3.2 million in payments to Judge Hartwell and her immediate family. This doesn't include indirect benefits like favorable investment opportunities and gifts disguised as business transactions. She highlighted one particularly damning transaction. Here we see $50,000 transferred from a Blackstone shell company to Judge Hartwell's husband's consulting firm exactly 1 week after she ruled in favor of Blackstone's client in a $2 million case. Crawford objected repeatedly, challenging the connections between payments and specific cases, but Dr. Chen's analysis was meticulous and well documented. As the week progressed, more victims testified. Andre Williams, the veteran whose construction company was destroyed, spoke powerfully about serving his country only to be betrayed by its justice system. Lisa Park, whose family's dry cleaning business was forced into bankruptcy, described how Hartwell had mocked her accent during proceedings. Each story added weight to the prosecution's case. The pattern was undeniable: minority-owned businesses systematically targeted, evidence ignored or excluded, predetermined outcomes delivered with a veneer of legal propriety. On Friday afternoon, Catherine called Eleanor Martinez, a former law clerk for Judge Hartwell who had witnessed the corruption firsthand. Ms. Martinez, why did you leave Judge Hartwell's employment? I couldn't continue being part of what was happening, Eleanor replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I saw her meeting privately with certain attorneys, discussing cases before hearing arguments. I saw her dismissing evidence without reading it. When I questioned some of her rulings, she told me I was too naive to understand how the real world worked. Did you report your concerns? I tried. I went to the chief judge, but he said I was mistaken. He suggested I might want to reconsider my career in law if I couldn't handle the realities of the system. What made you come forward now? Eleanor looked directly at Hartwell. When I heard about Agent Hamilton's investigation, I realized I wasn't alone in seeing this. Other people knew something was wrong. I couldn't stay silent anymore. As court adjourned for the weekend, the weight of testimony hung heavy in the air. The defense would begin presenting their case on Monday, but they faced an uphill battle. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern crystal clear. Outside the courthouse, crowds had grown larger each day. Community groups held vigils for the victims, while legal reform advocates used the trial to push for systemic changes. The case had become a lightning rod for discussions about justice, equality, and accountability. Marcus stood on the courthouse steps, watching as Maria Gonzalez spoke to reporters about rebuilding her business. James Patterson stood nearby, surrounded by supporters from his community. These were the people who had suffered in silence for years, told they were wrong, incompetent, or oversensitive when they questioned unfair treatment. Now their voices were being heard. Their experiences were being validated. And the person who had wielded the gavel like a weapon against them would finally face justice herself. As Marcus headed home, he thought about the week ahead. The defense would try to explain away the evidence, to paint Hartwell as a tough but fair judge caught up in others' schemes. But the truth had momentum now, and it would not be easily stopped. The real question wasn't whether Hartwell was guilty. The evidence had established that beyond reasonable doubt. The question was whether this trial would spark the broader changes needed to prevent such corruption from taking root again. Justice, Marcus reflected, wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing, it was about restoring faith in the system itself, and that work was just beginning. The defense began presenting its case on a humid Monday morning, with storm clouds gathering over Atlanta like an omen. Jonathan Crawford rose with the practiced confidence of a lawyer who had turned impossible cases before, though the weight of evidence against his client was clearly taking its toll. "The defense calls Dr. William Thornton," Crawford announced. Dr. Thornton, a distinguished-looking man with silver temples and wire-rimmed glasses, took the stand. He identified himself as a professor of judicial psychology at Emory University and an expert on courtroom behavior and decision-making. "Dr. Thornton," Crawford began, "you've reviewed transcripts and recordings from Judge Hartwell's courtroom. What are your observations?" "Judge Hartwell exhibits what we call judicial firmness," Thornton explained in an academic tone. "Some judges adopt a stern demeanor to maintain courtroom control. This can sometimes be misinterpreted as bias. Is it unusual for judges to be stricter with pro se litigants? Not at all. Self-represented parties often lack understanding of court procedures. Judges may appear impatient, but this reflects frustration with procedural delays, not personal bias." Catherine rose for cross-examination, her approach sharp and direct. "Dr. Thornton, you're being paid $500 an hour for your testimony, correct? That's my standard rate for expert testimony. And you've testified for the defense in 16 judicial misconduct cases. I testify where my expertise is needed." Catherine displayed a transcript on the screen. When Judge Hartwell told Maria Gonzalez that American courts weren't for people who couldn't speak proper English, was that judicial firmness or ethnic bias? Thornton shifted uncomfortably. "Without full context." "The context, Doctor, is that Ms. Gonzalez speaks fluent English and was trying to present evidence of fraud. Is telling a Hispanic business owner to stick to cooking an example of maintaining courtroom control?" That particular comment was perhaps unfortunate, or discriminatory. The cross-examination continued relentlessly, with Catherine systematically dismantling Thornton's attempts to reframe Hartwell's behavior as mere judicial sternness. By the time he left the stand, his credibility was in tatters. Crawford next called a series of character witnesses, fellow judges, attorneys, and civic leaders who testified to Hartwell's reputation and accomplishments. But their praise felt hollow against the weight of evidence already presented. Judge Patricia Winters, a colleague of Hartwell's, testified about their long friendship. Victoria is demanding but fair. She holds everyone to high standards. On cross-examination, Catherine asked pointedly, "Were you aware that minority defendants in Judge Hartwell's court were 3 times more likely to lose their cases than white defendants?" No, I wasn't aware of those statistics." "Were you aware she had received over $3 million in payments connected to her rulings?" "Absolutely not." Tuesday brought the testimony everyone had been anticipating. Victoria Hartwell herself took the stand, dressed in a conservative navy suit, her face composed but showing the strain of the trial. Crawford approached his client carefully. "Judge Hartwell, how long have you served on the federal bench?" 22 years, she replied, her voice steady but lacking its usual commanding tone. "Have you ever accepted a bribe?" "Never. Every financial transaction involving me or my family was legitimate and properly reported." "How do you explain the payments traced to your accounts?" Hartwell straightened in her chair. "My husband runs a successful consulting business. He's worked with many law firms and corporations. Any payments were for his legitimate services." "What about the pattern of rulings favoring certain parties?" "I rule based on law and facts. If certain attorneys are better prepared, their clients naturally have better outcomes. That's not corruption. That's competent representation." Crawford walked her through various cases, allowing her to explain her rulings. Hartwell portrayed herself as a strict constructionist who simply applied the law without favor or prejudice. "The recordings suggest you made comments about people like the defendant Marcus Hamilton." "What did you mean?" Hartwell's jaw tightened slightly. "I meant people who come to court unprepared, who think they can argue law without legal training. It had nothing to do with race." Catherine Walsh rose for cross-examination like a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. Her first question cut straight to the bone. "Judge Hartwell, you testified that you rule based on law and facts. Is that correct?" "Yes." "Then why did you refuse to examine Maria Gonzalez's evidence of forged documents?" "The evidence was submitted improperly. It was submitted according to court rules. You didn't even look at it. Why?" Hartwell's composure flickered. "I make hundreds of evidentiary rulings. I don't recall every specific instance." Catherine displayed the case transcript. "Let me refresh your memory. You said, quote, 'I don't need to see your papers. The plaintiff's documentation is sufficient.' Does that sound like ruling based on facts?" Taken out of context, the context was that Ms. Gonzalez was trying to prove fraud. You prevented her from doing so. Why? "I ruled based on my assessment of the case." Catherine moved methodically through case after case, each question tightening the noose. She displayed financial records, played recorded conversations, and confronted Hartwell with her own words. "Let's talk about the Patterson Funeral Home case. You granted summary judgment in 15 minutes. The typical hearing for such motions averages 2 hours. Why the rush?" "The facts were clear." "Clear? Mr. Patterson had evidence the signature was forged. You wouldn't let him present it. Is that your idea of clear facts?" Hartwell's attorney facade was cracking. Mr. Patterson was emotional, disrupting proceedings. He was trying to save his family's 76-year-old business. Is emotion not permitted in your courtroom when facing such loss? The cross-examination lasted all day. By late afternoon, Hartwell looked exhausted. Her earlier confidence evaporated. Catherine saved her most devastating questions for last. "Judge Hartwell, Let's discuss the recording of your conversation with Blackstone attorney Michael Reynolds on March 15th, 2023. She played the audio. Hartwell's voice filled the courtroom. Don't worry about the evidence. These people never have proper documentation anyway. Just make sure the payment goes through the offshore account this time. The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Hartwell, who are these people? I don't recall that conversation. Your voice is on the recording. Who are these people who never have proper documentation? Hartwell looked desperately at her attorney. I want to invoke my Fifth Amendment right. You've already testified, Judge. You've waived that right. Who are these people? The silence stretched. Finally, Hartwell mumbled, the pro se litigants. All pro se litigants, or specific types? I don't see color in my courtroom. Catherine displayed a chart. Then how do you explain that minority pro se litigants lost 92% of cases in your court, while white pro se litigants lost only 41%? Those statistics can be misleading. What's misleading about them? Are you saying minority litigants are simply worse at presenting their cases? Hartwell was trapped. Any answer would damn her further. She remained silent. Wednesday brought technical witnesses who tried to challenge the financial evidence, but FBI forensic accountants systematically refuted their arguments. The money trail was too clear, the pattern too established. Thursday featured Hartwell's husband Thomas attempting to explain the payments as legitimate consulting fees, but under Catherine's surgical cross-examination, he couldn't provide details about what services he had actually provided. You received $50,000 from Blackstone's shell company. What specific consulting did you do? I advised on business strategy. What strategy? Be specific. General corporate guidance. Can you name a single specific recommendation you made? Thomas Hartwell fumbled for answers that wouldn't come. The jury watched his discomfort with knowing looks. Friday morning, Crawford made a last desperate attempt with a surprise witness, Judge Harold Morrison, who had reviewed Hartwell's judicial record. I found no clear evidence of bias in Judge Hartwell's legal reasoning, Morrison testified. But Catherine was ready. Judge Morrison, isn't it true you were censured in 2019 for making racially insensitive comments during a bar association dinner? Morrison's face reddened. That was taken out of context. You said, and I quote, "Some cultures just aren't suited for complex business litigation." Is that the context? The damage was done. The defense's own witness had revealed his own bias, undermining his credibility entirely. As the defense rested, the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Closing arguments would begin Monday, but the outcome seemed increasingly inevitable. That evening, Marcus sat in the prosecutor's office with Catherine and Elena reviewing the week's testimony. She destroyed herself on the stand, Elena observed. The Fifth Amendment invocation was devastating. Catherine nodded. The jury saw through every excuse. But we can't be complacent. Crawford is skilled at closing arguments. Marcus looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline. It's bigger than just convicting Hartwell. This trial has exposed how the system can be corrupted from within. The question is whether we'll learn from it. The weekend brought unprecedented media coverage. Legal experts analyzed every aspect of the trial. Civil rights leaders called for comprehensive judicial reform. The hashtag Dr. Justice for Sale trended nationally. Sunday night, Marcus received a call from his father. Son, I've been watching every day. You've done something important. Win or lose tomorrow, you've shown that the system can be challenged. We're going to win, Dad. But you're right. The real victory is that people are paying attention. They're seeing how power without accountability corrupts everything it touches. As Marcus prepared for the final phase of the trial, he thought about all the victims who had testified, all the lives damaged by corruption masquerading as justice. Tomorrow, 12 ordinary citizens would decide whether a federal judge was above the law she had sworn to uphold. The storm clouds that had threatened all week finally broke that night, rain washing the city streets clean. It felt symbolic, a cleansing before the final act of this drama. In her cell, Victoria Hartwell sat awake, perhaps finally understanding that her contempt for those people had led to her downfall. The gavel she had wielded so carelessly against others would now render judgment on her. The defense had presented its case, but it had only highlighted the prosecution's evidence. Character witnesses couldn't erase financial records. Expert testimony couldn't explain away recorded conversations. And Hartwell's own words had condemned her more effectively than any prosecutor could. As dawn approached, the city prepared for the trial's conclusion. Justice, so long delayed and denied in Hartwell's courtroom, was finally within reach. The only question remaining was whether the jury would have the courage to hold a judge accountable for betraying everything the justice system was meant to represent. Monday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that follows a storm, the air crisp and charged with anticipation. The courthouse steps were packed with protesters, supporters, and media from across the nation. This wasn't just the conclusion of a trial. It was a moment of reckoning for the American justice system. Inside courtroom 2A, every seat was filled. Marcus Hamilton sat behind the prosecution table, his notepad filled with observations from weeks of testimony. Beside him, Catherine Walsh arranged her notes for what would be the most important closing argument of her career. Judge Rodriguez entered precisely at 9, her expression grave with the weight of the moment. "We'll hear closing arguments this morning," she announced. "Ms. Walsh, you may proceed." Catherine rose, walking to the center of the courtroom with measured steps. She stood silent for a moment, letting the gravity of the situation settle over the jury. "Members of the jury," she began, her voice clear and resonant, "you've heard weeks of testimony, seen hundreds of documents, and listened to dozens of recordings. But this case comes down to a simple question. Is anyone above the law?" She moved closer to the jury box. Judge Victoria Hartwell took an oath to administer justice fairly and impartially. Instead, she turned her courtroom into a marketplace where verdicts were bought and sold, where justice was available only to those who could pay her price. Catherine displayed a photograph of the courthouse. This building stands as a symbol of justice, equality before the law, and the promise that every person who enters will be heard fairly. Judge Hartwell betrayed that promise every single day she sat on that bench. She walked through the evidence methodically, weaving together financial records, victim testimony, and Hartwell's own words. You heard Maria Gonzalez describe how Judge Hartwell mocked her accent and dismissed her evidence without examination. You heard James Patterson explain how 4 generations of service to his community were nearly destroyed by forged documents the judge refused to investigate. Catherine's voice hardened. But most damning of all, you heard Judge Hartwell's own words. When she thought no one was listening, she revealed her true nature. These people never have proper documentation anyway. These people, not litigants, not citizens seeking justice, but these people, a phrase dripping with contempt and prejudice. She displayed the financial charts. $3.2 million. That's what Judge Hartwell received for perverting justice. But the real cost was immeasurable. Businesses destroyed, families bankrupted, faith in our legal system shattered. Catherine paused, making eye contact with each juror. The defense wants you to believe this was all a misunderstanding, that Judge Hartwell was simply tough on unprepared litigants. But you've seen the pattern. Minority defendants lost at 3 times the rate of white defendants. Contributors to her campaign fund won 87% of their cases. This wasn't toughness, it was corruption. She moved to the recording equipment. Let's listen once more to Judge Hartwell's own words. The courtroom filled with Hartwell's voice. Just make sure the payment goes through the offshore account this time." "Those aren't the words of a fair judge," Catherine continued. "They're the words of someone selling justice to the highest bidder." She returned to the center of the room. "The defense will tell you that Judge Hartwell was a respected jurist, that she gave to charity, that she mentored young lawyers. But none of that excuses what she did in that courtroom. When she put on that robe, she had one job: to provide equal justice under law. She failed that duty spectacularly and deliberately." Catherine's closing reached its crescendo. "You have the power to send a message that no one, not even a federal judge, is above the law, that justice cannot be bought, that prejudice has no place in our courts, and that those who betray their oath will be held accountable." She concluded quietly but powerfully. Judge Hartwell had a choice every day she sat on that bench. She chose greed over justice, prejudice over fairness, corruption over integrity. Now you must choose. Choose justice. Choose accountability. Choose to tell every corrupt official that their day of reckoning will come. Find Victoria Hartwell guilty on all counts. As Catherine returned to her seat, the courtroom remained silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Jonathan Crawford rose slowly, adjusting his suit jacket as he approached the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone measured and reasonable, "you've heard a compelling story from the prosecution. But stories aren't evidence, and accusations aren't facts." He gestured toward Hartwell. "Judge Victoria Hartwell served this community for over 2 decades. She made tough decisions, unpopular decisions, but always legal decisions. The prosecution wants you to believe she suddenly became a criminal mastermind, orchestrating a vast conspiracy. Does that make sense?" Crawford paced before the jury. "Let's talk about what they've actually proven. Yes, Judge Hartwell's husband received payments from law firms. He runs a consulting business. That's not illegal. Yes, some litigants were unhappy with her rulings. Find me a judge who hasn't had complaints." He addressed the statistics. "The prosecution throws around numbers about minority defendants losing more often. But they don't tell you that many of these cases involved pro-SC litigants who simply didn't understand court procedures. Correlation isn't causation." Crawford's voice rose with passion. "What about the character witnesses? Respected judges, attorneys, community leaders, all testifying to Judge Hartwell's integrity. Are they all lying? All part of this supposed conspiracy?" He moved to the evidence table. "The prosecution relies heavily on Richard Blackstone's testimony. The admitted criminal, a confessed liar, a man facing decades in prison who would say anything to reduce his sentence. Is that the foundation you want to build a conviction on?" Crawford addressed the recordings. "Yes, Judge Hartwell made some inelegant comments. She spoke hastily, perhaps insensitively. But poor word choice isn't a crime. Frustration with unprepared litigants isn't corruption." He stood directly before the jury. "The burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. Not suspicion, not possibility, but beyond reasonable doubt. Can you honestly say there's no reasonable explanation for these payments other than bribery? No innocent interpretation of these conversations?" Crawford's voice softened. "Judge Hartwell dedicated her life to the law. One case, one suspicious case involving an FBI agent who came into her courtroom under false pretenses, and suddenly her entire career is suspect. That's not justice. That's a witch hunt." He concluded with quiet intensity. "The prosecution asks you to destroy a woman's life, to brand her a criminal, based on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of admitted criminals. I ask you to look at the whole picture, to consider the reasonable doubts, and to acquit Judge Victoria Hartwell of all charges." Judge Rodriguez spent the next hour instructing the jury on the law, carefully explaining each charge and the elements that must be proven beyond reasonable doubt. The jury filed out at 11:47 a.m. to begin deliberations. The waiting began. In the prosecution's conference room, Marcus, Catherine, and Elena reviewed their case one more time, though there was nothing more to be done. "Crawford did what he could," Elena observed. "But the evidence is overwhelming." Catherine nodded. "Still, you never know with juries. All it takes is one holdout." Marcus stared out the window at the crowds gathered below. "Whatever happens, we've exposed the truth. The system will have to change." In the courthouse cafeteria, victims gathered in small groups, sharing stories and anxiously checking their phones for updates. Maria Gonzalez sat with James Patterson, both finding comfort in their shared experience. "However this ends," Patterson said, "at least people know what happened to us was wrong. We weren't crazy or incompetent. We were targeted." The afternoon stretched on. At 3:30, word spread that the jury had a question. Everyone rushed back to the courtroom. "The jury wants to review the financial records related to the Patterson case," Judge Rodriguez announced. Catherine and Marcus exchanged glances. The jury was being thorough, examining specific evidence. That was generally good for the prosecution. By 5 iron, there was no verdict. Judge Rodriguez sent the jury to their hotel for the night, ordering them to return at 9 a.m. to continue deliberations. That evening, the city remained on edge. News programs featured panels of legal experts analyzing every aspect of the trial. Social media buzzed with speculation and debate. The case had become more than a legal proceeding. It was a referendum on justice itself. Marcus couldn't sleep. He walked the quiet streets of Atlanta, thinking about his father's auto shop, about all the small businesses destroyed by corruption, about the courage it took for victims to come forward. His phone buzzed with a text from his father. "Proud of you, son. Whatever happens tomorrow, you did right." Tuesday morning brought crowds even larger than the day before. The jury resumed deliberations at 9 a.m. sharp. By 11 hour, rumors swirled that they were close to a verdict. At 11:47, exactly 24 hours after they began, word came. The jury had reached a decision. The courtroom filled quickly. Hartwell sat rigidly at the defense table, her face pale but composed. The victims packed the gallery, many holding hands. Marcus felt his heart racing as the jury filed in. Judge Rodriguez addressed the foreperson. "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "Please hand the verdict form to the bailiff." The bailiff carried the paper to Judge Rodriguez, who read it silently before handing it back. The tension was unbearable. "Will the defendant please rise?" Hartwell stood, Crawford beside her. "Madam Foreperson, what is your verdict?" The foreperson, a middle-aged teacher named Sandra Williams, spoke clearly. "On count 1, conspiracy to commit honest services fraud, we find the defendant, Victoria Hartwell, guilty." A collective intake of breath swept the courtroom. "On count 2, racketeering, we find the defendant guilty." Hartwell gripped the table for support. "On count 3, money laundering, we find the defendant guilty." The foreperson continued through all 18 counts. Guilty on every single charge. Hartwell collapsed into her chair as the gallery erupted. Some victims wept openly, others embraced. Reporters rushed to file their stories. Judge Rodriguez banged her gavel. "Order! Order in the court!" She waited for quiet before continuing. "The defendant is remanded to custody pending sentencing. This court is adjourned." As marshals approached to take Hartwell into custody, she turned to look at Marcus. For a moment, their eyes met across the courtroom. The woman who had mocked him, who had wielded her power like a weapon against the vulnerable, was now facing the consequences of her actions. The handcuffs clicked around her wrists, the same sound that had ended her reign of corruption months earlier. As she was led away, the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Justice had come full circle. Outside, Catherine addressed the media. "Today's verdict sends a clear message. No one is above the law. The justice system belongs to all Americans, not just those with power or connections. Marcus stood with the victims, watching as Maria Gonzalez spoke to reporters about rebuilding her business with dignity restored. James Patterson announced plans to establish a legal aid fund for small business owners facing predatory lawsuits. As the crowds dispersed and the cameras turned off, Marcus felt a profound sense of completion. The investigation that had consumed 2 years of his life had achieved its goal, but more than that, it had sparked a national conversation about equality, justice, and the sacred trust placed in those who wear the robe. The system could be corrupted, but it could also be cleansed. It required vigilance, courage, and the unwavering belief that justice, true justice, was worth fighting for. 3 months after the verdict, the federal courthouse was once again packed for Victoria Hartwell's sentencing hearing. The intervening time had seen a cascade of consequences, more arrests, additional guilty pleas, and the beginning of systemic reforms throughout Georgia's judicial system. Marcus Hamilton sat in the gallery this time, his role as a witness complete. Beside him were many of the victims whose lives had been forever altered by Hartwell's corruption. They had come not for revenge, but for closure, to see justice finally served on someone who had denied it to so many others. Judge Rodriguez entered the courtroom, her expression solemn. "We are here for sentencing in United States versus Victoria Hartwell. Are all parties present?" Catherine Walsh stood. "The government is ready, Your Honor." Jonathan Crawford rose as well, looking considerably grayer than he had during the trial. "The defense is present, Your Honor." "Before I pronounce sentence, we will hear victim impact statements. Ms. Walsh," Catherine called the first speaker. Maria Gonzalez approached the podium, a folder clutched in her hands. She had regained much of her confidence in the months since the trial, her catering business now thriving again. "Your Honor," Maria began, her voice steady, "Judge Hartwell didn't just take my business. She took my faith in America. When I came to this country, I believed in the promise of equal justice. In her courtroom, I learned that justice had a price tag." She looked directly at Hartwell. "You called me an incompetent immigrant. You said I should stick to cooking. But I built a successful business that employed 12 people. You destroyed it with a stroke of your pen, not because of facts or law, but because I couldn't pay your price." Maria's voice strengthened. "My business is back now, stronger than before. But the 2 years I lost, the stress that made my mother sick, the college fund I had to drain, those things can't be returned. You stole more than money. You stole dignity, hope, and trust." James Patterson spoke next, his deep voice filling the courtroom. "Your Honor, Patterson Funeral Home served our community for 4 generations. We buried the poor for free, comforted the grieving, and provided dignity in death for those society often forgot." He turned to face Hartwell. "You almost destroyed all of that. Not through fair judgment, but through greed. You ignored evidence, silenced truth, and served the highest bidder. The stress nearly killed my wife. My son left college to help save our business. My community lost faith in the system meant to protect them." Patterson's eyes glistened. "But we survived. We're still serving our community. And today, we see that justice, though delayed, is not denied." 17 more victims spoke, each testimony adding weight to the human cost of Hartwell's crimes. Andre Williams, the veteran whose construction company was targeted, spoke of losing contracts because of the fraudulent judgment. Lisa Park described how her family's dry cleaning business, built over 30 years, was forced into bankruptcy. When the victims finished, Crawford made his plea for leniency. "Your Honor, Ms. Hartwell has already lost everything. Her career, her reputation, her freedom. She's 62 years old. A lengthy sentence would effectively be a life sentence." Crawford gestured to letters stacked on his table. We've submitted character references from colleagues, community members, and family. They paint a picture of a woman who gave generously to charity, mentored young lawyers, and served her community." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Ms. Hartwell made terrible mistakes. She lost her way, but she's not the monster the prosecution portrayed. We ask for the minimum sentence under the guidelines." Catherine's response was sharp and direct. "Your Honor, the defendant systematically sold justice for 7 years. She targeted vulnerable populations, destroyed businesses, and corrupted the very institution she swore to serve. Her charitable giving was funded by her victims' losses. Her mentoring taught young lawyers that justice was for sale. She held up pre-sentencing reports. The defendant shows no genuine remorse. In her interview, she still maintains she did nothing wrong, that she was simply a tough judge. She's learned nothing." Catherine's voice hardened. "The sentencing guidelines suggest 15 to 20 years. The government requests the maximum, not for vengeance, but because the severity of her betrayal demands it. She violated the sacred trust placed in federal judges. Without severe consequences, we risk encouraging others to follow her path." Judge Rodriguez nodded. "Ms. Hartwell, do you wish to address the court?" Hartwell stood slowly, her orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the robe she once wore. She had aged visibly during the trial, her face drawn, her posture diminished. "Your Honor," she began, her voice barely audible, "I dedicated my life to the law. I worked hard to reach the bench. If I was tough on litigants, it was because I believed in maintaining high standards." She paused, seeming to struggle with her words. I thought I was protecting the integrity of the court system. If people were hurt by my decisions, I regret that." The statement fell flat. Several victims shook their heads. Maria Gonzalez whispered something to James Patterson, who patted her hand comfortingly. Judge Rodriguez shuffled papers for a moment before speaking. "Ms. Hartwell, I presided over many sentencing hearings. Rarely have I seen a defendant so divorced from the reality of their actions. You speak of maintaining standards while you systematically sold verdicts. You express regret that people were hurt not for hurting them." She leaned forward. "You held one of the most powerful positions in our society, a federal judge, lifetime appointed, answerable to almost no one. With that power came sacred obligations, to be fair, impartial, and incorruptible. You failed on all counts." Rodriguez's voice grew stern. "You didn't just take bribes. You weaponized the justice system against the vulnerable. You targeted minority business owners knowing they lacked resources to fight back. You perverted the law to serve your greed and prejudice." She gestured to the gallery. "These victims trusted in American justice. You taught them that trust was misplaced. The damage you've done extends far beyond financial losses. You've shaken faith in our entire system." Rodriguez straightened. "The sentence must reflect the gravity of your crimes and serve as a deterrent to others who might abuse judicial power. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Hartwell swayed slightly, Crawford steadying her. "Additionally," Rodriguez continued, "you are ordered to pay restitution of $3.2 million to your victims and forfeit all assets derived from your criminal activities. You are permanently barred from holding any position of public trust." As marshals moved to escort Hartwell out, she turned one last time to look at the gallery. Her eyes met Marcus Hamilton's, and for a moment, he saw something like understanding dawn in them. Too late to matter, but perhaps genuine at last. Outside the courthouse, the scene was jubilant but reflective. Victims embraced, many crying with relief. Reporters surrounded Catherine Walsh and Marcus Hamilton. "This sentence sends a clear message," Catherine told the assembled media. "Judicial corruption will be met with severe consequences. No robe, no title, no position places anyone above the law." Marcus addressed the deeper implications. This case exposed systematic failures that allowed corruption to flourish. The real work begins now, reforming oversight, improving accountability, and ensuring this never happens again. In the weeks following sentencing, the ripple effects continued. The Judicial Conference implemented new financial disclosure requirements and established an independent inspector general for the federal courts. Law schools nationwide added ethics courses focusing on judicial corruption and implicit bias. The Georgia legislature passed the Hartwell Reforms, creating a civilian oversight board for judicial conduct and requiring annual bias training for all judges. Several other states introduced similar legislation. More significantly, the case sparked a national conversation about access to justice. Bar associations launched programs to provide pro bono representation for small business owners. Community organizations developed court advocacy programs to help pro-se litigants navigate the system. Marcus returned to FBI headquarters in Washington, where he was promoted to lead a new public corruption task force. His first initiative was creating a hotline for reporting judicial misconduct, staffed by attorneys who could evaluate complaints and guide victims through the process. 6 months after sentencing, Marcus visited Atlanta for the opening of the Patterson Legal Aid Center, funded by donations that poured in after the trial. James Patterson had transformed part of his funeral home into a resource center for small business owners facing legal challenges. "You helped us believe in justice again," Patterson told Marcus as they toured the facility. "Now we're going to help others fight back against corruption." Maria Gonzalez's catering company had expanded to 3 locations. She employed 25 people, many from immigrant communities. "I learned that silence enables corruption," she said at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. "Now I teach others to speak up, to demand fairness, to know their rights." The Hartwell case became required study at the FBI Academy, a textbook example of how to investigate judicial corruption. Law reviews published dozens of articles analyzing its implications for judicial oversight and ethics enforcement. Marcus often reflected on that day in Hartwell's courtroom, when she had mocked him, never suspecting he was documenting her downfall. The moment had crystallized everything wrong with unchecked power, the casual cruelty, the ingrained prejudice, the assumption of impunity. But the case had also revealed something hopeful, that the system, though flawed, contained mechanisms for self-correction when good people refused to accept corruption as inevitable. The victims who testified, the witnesses who came forward, the jury that saw through excuses, they all proved that justice, though sometimes delayed, could prevail. A year after sentencing, the Department of Justice released a comprehensive report on the Hartwell investigation. It documented systemic reforms implemented nationwide, showed a marked increase in judicial misconduct reports, and demonstrated improved outcomes for pro-se litigants. The report concluded, "The Hartwell case represents a watershed moment in judicial accountability. It exposed how bias and corruption can infect our courts while demonstrating that no position grants immunity from justice. Most importantly, it reaffirmed that the American legal system belongs to all citizens, not just those with power or connections." For Marcus, the report's dry language couldn't capture the human element, the tears of relief in Maria Gonzalez's eyes when the verdict was read, the dignity in James Patterson's voice as he reclaimed his family's legacy, the quiet courage of court clerk Carla Simmons finally speaking truth to power. Justice wasn't just about punishment or deterrence, it was about restoration, giving back to communities what corruption had stolen, rebuilding trust in institutions, and proving that the promise of equal justice under law wasn't just words carved in marble. As he prepared for his next assignment, investigating corruption in another city's courts, Marcus kept a photo on his desk. The crowd outside the courthouse the day of Hartwell's sentencing, victims and supporters joined in shared victory. It reminded him why he did this work and why it mattered. The system could be corrupted, but it could also be cleansed. It required vigilance, courage, and the unwavering belief that justice, true justice, was worth fighting for. The Hartwell case had proven that, and its lessons would echo through American courtrooms for generations to come. 5 years after Victoria Hartwell's handcuffs clicked shut, Marcus Hamilton stood in the FBI Academy auditorium, preparing to address a new class of agents specializing in public corruption investigations. The room was filled with eager faces, many drawn to this field specifically because of the Hartwell case, which had become legendary within the Bureau. Marcus adjusted his notes, though he rarely needed them anymore. This story had become part of him, woven into his understanding of justice, corruption, and the constant vigilance required to protect the integrity of American institutions. The Hartwell investigation began with data, he told the assembled agents, but it succeeded because we understood it was really about people. Behind every statistic was a family whose business was destroyed, a dream that was crushed, a community that lost faith in justice. He clicked to a slide showing the original pattern analysis that had triggered the investigation. Minority-owned businesses were losing cases at 3 times the rate of white-owned businesses in Judge Hartwell's court. But numbers alone don't make a case. We needed to understand the human impact. The next slide showed photos of the victims who had testified. Maria Gonzalez had built her catering business over 15 years. James Patterson's funeral home had served his community for 4 generations. These weren't just economic losses. They were attacks on generational wealth, community institutions, and the American dream itself. Marcus paused, letting his words sink in. But here's what's crucial to understand. Victoria Hartwell didn't see herself as corrupt. She believed she was maintaining high standards, protecting the integrity of the court system. Her bias was so ingrained that she couldn't recognize it as prejudice. A hand shot up. Agent Sarah Chen, fresh from Quantico. "Sir, how do we identify this kind of systemic corruption when the perpetrators genuinely believe they're doing the right thing?" Marcus smiled slightly. "That's exactly the right question. The answer lies in patterns, accountability, and most importantly, in listening to the people who are being hurt." In Hartwell's case, victims had been complaining for years. They were dismissed as sore losers, incompetent business owners, or overly sensitive. The system protected itself by discrediting its critics. He advanced to a slide showing the recording device he had worn during his undercover appearance. "When I stood in that courtroom posing as a defendant, Hartwell said something that revealed everything. 'People like you always think you're special.' Those 4 words, 'people like you,' contained all the bias, all the prejudice that had poisoned her courtroom for years." Another agent raised his hand. "But how do we distinguish between legitimate tough judging and actual bias?" "Look at the outcomes," Marcus replied. "A tough judge should be tough on everyone equally. When toughness correlates with race, economic status, or political connections, you're not looking at high standards. You're looking at discrimination." He clicked to a chart showing the financial web they had uncovered. Follow the money always. Hartwell received $3.2 million through various channels, but the real cost was immeasurable. Destroyed businesses, shattered lives, eroded faith in justice itself. The next slide showed the packed courtroom during sentencing. When Hartwell was sentenced to 18 years, some people called it harsh. But consider this. She had sentenced hundreds of people to financial ruin, business failure, and personal devastation. She weaponized the very system meant to protect the vulnerable. Marcus moved to the impact slides. 5 years later, what's changed? The Judicial Conference implemented mandatory financial disclosures. 23 states created civilian oversight boards for judges. Law schools now require extensive ethics training focused on implicit bias and corruption. He showed statistics on improved outcomes for minority litigants. Pro se minority defendants now win cases at rates much closer to their white counterparts. reporting of judicial misconduct has increased by 300%. More importantly, those reports are being taken seriously. A photo of the Patterson Legal Aid Center appeared. James Patterson transformed part of his funeral home into a resource center for small business owners. Maria Gonzalez mentors immigrant entrepreneurs. The victims became advocates, turning their pain into purpose. Marcus clicked to a slide showing a recent ceremony. Last month, the American Bar Association presented its first Hartwell Award for courage in exposing judicial corruption. The recipient was Carla Simmons, the court clerk who kept detailed notes of Hartwell's misconduct for years before finally coming forward. He paused, remembering Simmons's testimony. She risked everything, her job, her reputation, her family's security, to speak truth to power. That's the kind of courage that makes reform possible. The next slide showed international coverage of the case. The Hartwell investigation resonated globally. Courts in 12 countries have implemented similar oversight measures. The United Nations cited our case in new guidelines for judicial accountability. Marcus moved to personal reflection. I grew up watching my father lose his auto repair shop to a similar scheme. He always told me, the system isn't for people like us. I joined the FBI to prove him wrong. The Hartwell case showed that while the system can be corrupted, it can also be reformed, but only if good people refuse to accept corruption as inevitable. He showed a slide of recent arrests. Since Hartwell, we've successfully prosecuted 17 federal judges, 43 state judges, and hundreds of attorneys involved in similar schemes. Each case builds on lessons learned here. A young agent asked, "Do you think we've solved the problem?" Marcus shook his head. Corruption is like a virus. It mutates, finds new hosts, exploits new weaknesses. Our job is constant vigilance. The Hartwell case gave us tools and awareness, but the fight never really ends. He advanced to a slide showing current investigations. Right now, we're tracking suspicious patterns in bankruptcy courts in 3 states. We're investigating campaign finance connections to judicial decisions in 5 major cities. The work continues. Marcus clicked to a photo from the original trial. When I revealed my FBI credentials in Hartwell's courtroom, she looked at me with absolute shock. She couldn't conceive that someone she had dismissed as powerless could bring her down. That's the blindness of unchecked power. He showed the famous photo of Hartwell being led away in handcuffs. This image became iconic not because we enjoy seeing people fall, but because it represents accountability. It shows that justice can reach anyone, no matter how high they climb. The next slide displayed testimonials from reform advocates. The case sparked a national conversation about access to justice. Bar associations created pro bono programs specifically for small business litigation. Community organizations developed court advocacy programs. Legal aid funding increased by 40% in 5 years. Marcus showed a graph of public trust in the judiciary. Trust in courts hit historic lows during the revelation of Hartwell's corruption. But look at this trend. As reforms took hold, as accountability increased, trust began to rebuild. Transparency breeds confidence. He clicked to a slide showing diversity in the federal judiciary. In the past 5 years, judicial appointments have become more diverse, not just racially, but in terms of professional background. Former public defenders, civil rights attorneys, and community advocates now sit where Hartwell once did. A photo of a recent judicial training session appeared. Implicit bias training is now mandatory for all federal judges. They study the Hartwell case, examining how unconscious prejudice can corrupt conscious decisions. Marcus showed a slide of himself with his father at a recent ceremony. My dad lived to see justice served. At 85, he reopened his auto shop with a small business grant. He still works every day, not because he needs to, but because he can. That's what justice looks like. Restoration, not just retribution. The next slide showed an international conference. Last year, I spoke at The Hague about judicial corruption. Representatives from 40 countries attended. The Hartwell case has become a global template for investigating and prosecuting judicial misconduct. Marcus displayed a quote from Judge Rodriguez's sentencing statement. "The damage you've done extends far beyond financial losses. You've shaken faith in our entire system." But here's what Judge Rodriguez didn't say. Marcus continued. "That shaken faith created an opportunity. Sometimes systems need to be shaken to be strengthened. The cracks Hartwell exposed allowed light to enter, illuminating problems we had ignored for too long." He showed a slide of recent polling data. Public confidence in the justice system has risen 15% since the Hartwell reforms. That's still not where it needs to be, but it's progress. Real, measurable progress. A photo appeared of Marcus receiving the FBI Director's Award for Excellence. Awards are nice, but they're not why we do this work. We do it for people like Maria Gonzalez, who can now trust that her business will be judged on merit, not ethnicity. For James Patterson, who knows his family legacy is protected by law, not subject to judicial whim. Marcus clicked to his final slide, a simple image of the scales of justice. The Hartwell case taught us that justice isn't a statue or a symbol. It's a practice, a daily commitment to fairness, equality, and accountability. It requires constant vigilance, courage to speak truth to power, and faith that the system, however flawed, can be improved. He closed his laptop and spoke directly to the agents. "You're entering this field at a crucial moment. The tools we developed, the patterns we identified, the networks we built, they're all at your disposal. But remember, behind every case file is a human story. Behind every statistic is someone's dream, someone's livelihood, someone's faith in America." Marcus picked up a worn notebook from the podium, Carla Simmons' original notes that had helped break the case. This notebook represents what one person with conscience can accomplish. Carla Simmons wasn't an FBI agent or a lawyer. She was a court clerk who saw injustice and decided to document it, even when speaking up seemed impossible. He held up the notebook. "Your job is to listen to the Carla Simmonses of the world, to hear the voices others dismiss, to see patterns others ignore, to stand up when it would be easier to stay silent." Marcus set down the notebook and looked at each agent in turn. The Hartwell case ended with handcuffs clicking shut, but it began with someone deciding that injustice was unacceptable. That decision, that moment of moral clarity, is where all reform begins. He paused, remembering that day in Hartwell's courtroom, when she had mocked him, never imagining that her prejudice would be her downfall. Power without accountability corrupts. Justice without equality isn't justice. These aren't just slogans. They're truths the Hartwell case proved beyond any reasonable doubt. Marcus concluded with quiet intensity. "You carry badges now. You have authority, resources, and responsibility. Use them wisely. Use them justly. And never forget that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone else has dismissed." As the agents filed out, many stopped to shake his hand or ask questions. Marcus saw in their eyes the same determination that had driven him, the same belief that justice was worth fighting for. Outside the academy, the sun was setting over Quantico, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Marcus thought about all the victims who had found their voices, all the judges who now thought twice before letting bias influence their decisions, all the communities that had learned to demand accountability. The system wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was better than it had been 5 years ago when Victoria Hartwell had sat smugly on her bench, certain that her position made her untouchable. Justice had proven her wrong. And somewhere in courtrooms across America, other corrupt officials were learning the same lesson, that in a democracy, power comes with accountability, and no one, absolutely no one, is above the law. Marcus smiled, thinking of his father's words after the verdict. Maybe the system can work for people like us after all. Maybe it could. As long as people like Marcus Hamilton, Carla Simmons, Maria Gonzalez, and James Patterson refuse to accept anything less.